Hey there, Saga Twist here, inviting you to settle in for something a little different. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story. Not just any story, but one that lingers. One that hums through the trees and hides in the stillness between heartbeats. This is the house where the forest waits. A 30-part horror bedtime tale woven with quiet dread, slow mystery, and just enough comfort to help you drift into sleep. Follow Mara as she steps into a forest where time forgets, doors remember, and even the silence has a memory. So close your eyes, let the story lead, and if the woods whisper your name, don't be afraid. You might just be coming home. In the deepest heart of Elder Hollow, where trees knit their branches so tightly that not even moonlight could pierce. Their canopy, there is said to be a house that no map shows and no road leads to. The house is quiet. Always. No one remembers when it was built. No one remembers who lived there first. It simply is. A structure lost to time, resting on the forest floor like a forgotten memory. The wood is gray, faded by the hands of countless seasons. The roof sags gently in the center, and ivy threads itself through the stone foundation like veins. It smells of damp soil, scorched herbs, and candle wax left to dry for years. There is only one way to find it, a narrow deer path choked with ferns and fog, almost invisible unless you're already lost. And even then, you might only see it if the forest wants you to. The house is not large, only 2 rooms. The front door opens with a sigh, as if waking from a long, uneasy sleep. Dust hangs in the air like ancient breath. The hearth is cold, though a strange warmth clings to the corners, like something had just left the room before you entered. The furniture is sparse. A shelf with a few unmarked jars, a small table with 1 chair tucked in, a single candle in the center melted into a puddle. But across the room, nestled between crooked walls and silence, is a rocking chair, and in front of that chair is a window. But the window does not look out on the woods, or the mountains, or the sky. It looks out into nothing. Not blackness, not night, just void. A gray, humming emptiness that seems to move if you look too long. Carved above the doorframe, in soft curling script, is a warning. Do not sit in the chair. Do not look through the window. That's the only rule. The only law this strange place knows. Visitors who have stumbled upon the house tell of a pull, something deep and ancient that urges them to step closer to the window. A whisper in the back of the mind. A hum in the bones. They say your name sounds different inside that house, as though the walls are trying it out, tasting it like a forgotten word. Local legend speaks of a woman named Elswith who once lived there. A healer, a listener, a woman made of silence and patience. She was kind to the sick, gentle to the grieving, but she never left the forest. Not once. People would come to her following that same deer path and return speaking of a woman with cold hands and faraway eyes. They say she could cure fever with a whisper. She could deliver babies on nights so stormy even the wolves wouldn't roam. They say she never asked for payment, only that visitors left something behind, something of meaning. A ring, a lock of hair, a name. But one year, a child followed the path and never came back. The next season, a trapper vanished without a trace. Then a midwife, a traveler, a woodsman. Each time the villagers grew more afraid. They stopped whispering Elswith's name. They started saying she had made a deal with whatever was beyond the window. One winter night they lit torches and walked the path together. 20 men and women, clutching pitchforks and prayers. But when they reached the house, they found no one, only the chair and the window, rocking gently, looking out into that endless, hungry gray. Since then, no one goes near Elder Hollow, but stories drift in like smoke from the mountains. Some say the house is still there, unchanged. Others say it moves, like a dream half remembered. Some claim to have seen light inside, flickering at dusk. Others say they heard their own voice calling from the woods, just off the path. And every few years, someone disappears, a hiker, a camper, a child chasing fireflies, and always the same whisper in the wind. Do not sit in the chair. Do not look through the window. But now, it's time to close your eyes. The woods are far away. The house is just a story. The deer path is buried beneath thyme and moss. The rocking chair is empty. The window is still, and you are safe. As long as you don't listen when the darkness knocks. As long as you don't let it see you seeing it. As long as you don't look. Too long. The forest was hushed that morning. Not silent, never silent, but hushed, like something had asked it politely to be quiet. The wind moved softly through the trees, bending them just enough to whisper to each other. Leaves rustled like pages being turned by careful hands, and down beneath the canopy, where dew still clung to the moss and morning light filtered in like mist, a man named Corwin walked alone. He wasn't lost. Not exactly. He had been hiking the trails of Elder Hollow for 3 days. A quiet trip, a break from the city's buzz, from bills and traffic and bright screens that never stopped blinking. His phone had died a day ago, but he hadn't minded. He liked the solitude. The air was cooler out here, older. But this morning was different. Corwin noticed it first in the birds. They stopped chirping the moment he stepped off the marked trail. Not gradually, instantly. One moment the air was filled with song. The next it was like something had sucked the sound away. Then came the ferns. They were taller here, wilder, curling up around the path like they were listening, watching. He stepped carefully, but they brushed his ankles, clung to his boots. The deeper he went, the thicker they became, until he was pushing through green walls, heart ticking faster than it should. Then he heard it. A whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind, just breeze passing through branches, but the trees weren't moving. The whisper came again, soft, slender, curling into his ear like smoke. "Don't sit in the chair." He froze. There was no one behind him, no one in front. The forest stood still. "Don't look through the window." The voice was right next to him now, gentle, familiar somehow, like an old song or a lullaby he'd forgotten long ago. And then, without knowing how, Corwin realized he was standing on a path he hadn't seen before. Narrow, muddy, choked with creeping vines. A deer path, the kind no map marks, the kind only finds you. He should have turned back. Every part of his mind screamed to return to the known trail, but his legs moved forward, slowly, willingly, as if the forest had loosened his bones and was guiding him itself. The whisper was gone now, but something else remained, a presence, a feeling. He walked for what felt like minutes, or hours. Time had twisted itself here. The trees grew thicker, leaning in, and then, through a curtain of ivy and rot, he saw it. The house, just as the stories said. Small, crooked. A chimney cracked open at the top like it had sighed too hard. One shutter hanging, the smell of burnt herbs and old wood. The air felt thicker here, like something was breathing just beneath the soil. And above the crooked door, carved in worn, curling letters, "Do not sit in the chair. Do not look through the window." Corwin blinked. His hand was already on the doorknob. Back in the trees, behind the whispering ferns, something smiled. It hadn't fed in a long time. The door creaked open with a sigh, as if the house exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Corwin stepped inside without a word, as though something had already whispered permission in his ear. The air was warmer inside, too warm, stale, and still, yet touched by something recent. Like the air in a room where a candle has just been blown out. Dust danced in the sunlight that leaked through a crack in the roof. It floated in the air like ash. The wooden floor groaned softly beneath his boots, the sound echoing in a house that should have been too small for echoes. He paused in the doorway, surveying the room. The stories were true. There was the rocking, a chair, faded wood, worn down by time, positioned directly in front of that strange gray window, the one that didn't look out into the forest, but into something else entirely. Something wrong, something empty. Corwin didn't look too long. Not yet. He turned his gaze elsewhere and saw a lantern hanging from a rusted hook by the door. It looked ancient, blackened at the edges and crusted with soot, but as his eyes landed on it, the lantern flickered to life. A soft blue flame curled. Up inside it, steady and silent, Corwin stepped back. He hadn't touched it. The air around it wasn't warm. There was no smell of oil, no sign of a match. Just a glow, calm and ghostly. And no matter how long he stared, the flame didn't move, didn't dance. It simply was. He reached up and carefully unhooked it. It felt cold, too cold, as if it had been buried in snow. Yet the flame inside remained untouched, trapped behind the glass, casting a dim circle of blue light that didn't quite reach the walls. He walked slowly through the room, holding it before him like a talisman. Shadows shrank from the glow, but they didn't disappear. They only shifted, circling the edges of the room like wolves just out of reach. There was a second door, slightly ajar. Beyond it, a narrow hallway stretched into darkness. He held the lantern toward it, but the flame only lit a few feet ahead, never more. As though the light refused to show him what lay too far ahead. He heard something then, a voice, quiet. Not in words, not fully. More like breathing. No, not his breathing. Someone else. Someone just down the hall. Corwin turned to leave. Every instinct inside him told him to get out. But when he faced the front door again, something had changed. The carvings above the frame were gone. In their place were new words, written in something that hadn't quite dried. Too late. His hand trembled on the doorknob. He twisted it. Locked. Not jammed, not stuck. Locked from the inside. The lantern flickered, just once, and behind him, the rocking chair creaked. He turned slowly. It was moving now, rocking gently, back and forth as though someone had just risen from it. But the room was empty, except for Corwin and the blue flame, which would not go out, no matter how hard he tried. The flame in the lantern burned blue and steady in Corwin's hands, casting ghost light over the warped wood beneath his feet. Behind him, the rocking chair groaned softly, back and forth, back and forth. He didn't turn around again. He couldn't. The house had become aware of him. The hallway yawned before him like a throat, narrow and crooked, filled with shadows that didn't flee from the light. His boots creaked on the boards, each step slower than the last, until he reached the threshold of the second room. And there, carved into the wall like someone had scratched with a fingernail, were names. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Scrawled, etched, pressed deep into the wood. Some were crisp and fresh, others looked warped with age, bleeding into the walls like old ink in paper. Alden, Bria, J. Murrow, Sawyer, Nora, Edel, Corwin. He froze. There it was, his name. Already carved, already waiting, but he hadn't written it. His breath hitched, and frost curled on the inside of the lantern's glass. He stepped closer, brushing his fingertips across the letters. They were warm, as if something had just finished carving them. He backed away, but his foot caught the edge of something beneath the floorboards, a loose plank. He knelt, set the lantern beside him, and pried it up with trembling fingers. Beneath it, in a small hollow, was a bundle of items, personal things, left behind, buried, forgotten. A child's sock, a silver ring, a photograph, water-warped and faded to nothing but shadows. A cracked pair of glasses, a dog tag, a ribbon stained red at the corner, a single page from a diary, the ink blurred except for the final line. I shouldn't have looked. And below that, you don't leave this house, you become it. Corwin felt the house breathing again, slow and low, like a deep wind beneath the floorboards. The walls creaked softly, and the lantern flickered. Then the name beneath his caught his eye. He squinted at it, heart beginning to race. Ellsworth. His pulse thudded in his ears. else with the woman from the stories, the healer who vanished, the one who had lived here before the house turned strange, before the window began to look out into something else. If her name was here, she had never left. The flame in the lantern hissed suddenly, flaring upward, and somewhere deep in the house, another door creaked open, though he hadn't seen one nearby. It was darker now. The lantern's glow seemed dimmer, the shadows thicker. They curled and moved differently, less like shadows, more like observers. He backed into the hallway, lantern in hand, and paused by the name wall one last time. And there, beneath his name, new letters were being etched, not by a hand, not by a blade. The wood itself was growing them, slowly twisting inward, burning the name into place like the house was tasting it, spelling out one more word, stay, and he understood then. You don't leave your name behind. Your name leaves you. There were more doors now than before. Corwin hadn't moved far, yet the house had rearranged itself, subtly, a turn that hadn't been there moments ago. A narrow stairwell where the wall had been smooth just seconds prior. He realized then, the house didn't follow logic. It followed attention. Whatever you focused on, it answered, and now it wanted to tell him a story. He stood before a tall, thin door. The knob was bone white, like old ivory, and colder than anything he'd touched since arriving. When he turned it, the door didn't open outward. It inhaled, pulling open like a breath drawn slowly between teeth. Inside was a room unlike the others. This one was preserved. Everything else in the house felt stale, dead, and ancient, but here the dust lay gently across books, vials, and bundles of dried herbs. A soft gray light filtered in through a round window high in the ceiling, and the smell of lavender and ash still clung to the air. This was someone's space, a healer's, a woman's Elswith's room. Corwin stepped in. A tall shelf stood against the back wall, filled with small glass bottles, some empty, some still holding thick liquids or dried roots. A black journal rested on a table beside a feather quill dipped in long dried ink. A mirror faced the corner, turned backward, and in the center of the room was a chair, different from the one near the window. This one was made of twisted vine-like wood, its legs slightly too long, as if it had grown from the floor itself. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been carved from something still alive. He didn't sit. Instead, he stepped toward the table and gently opened the journal. The pages whispered as he turned them. Most were unreadable, symbols, languages he didn't recognize, maps that led nowhere. But near the end, a page had been folded over. He opened it and found neat, elegant handwriting. Today I met a traveler who should not have found the path. He knocked before entering. That was rare. The house usually opens on its own. He asked if he could look through the window. I told him no. He asked if I ever had. I told him the truth, I only ever glanced. That was enough. I think it's learning. The house listens more closely now. It hums at night when I sleep. Sometimes I wake with new bruises, new cuts. I don't remember dreaming. The traveler was kind. He left me his name. That was the last thing he had. The lantern dimmed, and the pages curled in on themselves, as if the words had grown tired of being read. Then, behind him, a soft knock. Corwin turned. The mirror that had faced the wall was now tilted forward, slightly angled toward the floor. There was no reflection, just darkness. But in the dark, two faint eyes blinked open, and a voice whispered, "She's still here, but she doesn't know who she is anymore." Corwin backed away, stumbling into the table. The lantern flared, casting blue light across the journal, the mirror, the room full of forgotten memory, and then the door behind him closed, gently but firmly. Click. Locked again. Elswith's voice, softer now, broken by time, floated through. The room like dust. If you see the window, don't look at what's beyond it. Look at what's reflected inside. Corwin sat beside the closed door for what might have been an hour, or maybe longer. The lantern's blue flame glowed softly at his feet, casting arcs of light against the floorboards like ripples in water. The mirror hadn't moved again, but he could still feel it watching him. Eventually, the door unlatched on its own. No sound. No movement. Just a soft click, like the house had grown bored of waiting. Corwin rose, collected the lantern, and stepped back into the hall. Only, it wasn't the hall anymore. The walls had vanished. Trees now stood on either side, close and crowding, their bark damp and mottled with moss. Fog curled low along the ground. He turned around, but the house was gone. Behind him stood only trunks and silence. He was in the forest again, or something that remembered it. Corwin stepped cautiously between the trees, following no path but the one his boots found. The air was thicker here, not cold, but heavy. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every fern seemed to lean slightly in his direction, watching, listening. He heard something in the distance, faint footsteps, human, but far away and unhurried. Then a sound like breath through leaves. We remember. He froze. It wasn't a voice, not in the way voices usually worked. It was all around him, in the trees, the bark, the wind between the branches. She fed the roots. She spilled the words. She whispered to the dark. A fern beside him uncurled slightly, as if reaching for his hand. He stepped back. We remember her sorrow. We remember her leaving. We remember the window. Corwin's heart pounded. His feet moved faster now, though the fog deepened, thickening into a silvery cloud that shimmered with faint shapes, almost faces, almost hands. He came to a clearing. In the center stood a stone well, low to the ground, almost hidden beneath. Crawling ivy. A wooden bucket sat beside it, broken in half, its rope frayed and burned. The lantern flickered again, just once. Corwin knelt and peered over the edge. Inside, the darkness didn't behave like it should. It was wet, yes, but it moved. A liquid blackness, slow and churning, like ink stirred in water, and reflected in its depths, not far beneath the surface, was a face. His own, but older, paler, eyes like glass, mouth slightly open, a hint of shadow behind his teeth. He fell back with a cry, the sound swallowed instantly by the woods. When he looked again, the well was empty. Just water. Still and calm. Then the forest spoke once more. We remember the others. Names carved into bark, bones beneath roots. All around him trees shimmered, and the bark began to shift, curling inward like peeling skin. Names appeared, burned into the trunks, one after another. Sawyer, Bria, Murrow, Elswith, Corwin again. But now there was another. Corwin voided. The letters were faint, flickering like candlelight, as if the forest hadn't quite made up its mind. You have not chosen yet, the trees whispered. The house waits still, but so do we. Suddenly a path opened ahead. The trees bent back slightly, just enough to let him pass. The well behind him began to hum, low, steady, calling. But Corwin didn't look back. He walked toward the bent trees, toward the curve in the forest that didn't exist moments ago, and far, far ahead, at the very edge of the fog. The house waited again, exactly where it shouldn't be. The trees moved when he wasn't looking. That much Corwin now understood. As he walked, the forest pressed close behind him, never too fast, never loud, but always shifting, always closing. Each time he turned, a tree had crept an inch nearer, as if to taste the heat of his lantern's glow. And ahead, through the trees, the house had returned. It didn't look abandoned anymore. The windows glowed faintly with light, not warm, but cold like the stars. Smoke twisted from the crooked chimney in a lazy spiral. The door hung slightly open, just like the very first time. Only now, the carvings above it were fresh again. Come home. He paused just outside the door. The air felt different, thinner, as though the forest were holding its breath. He stepped inside. The house didn't sigh this time. It watched, and something else had changed. The furniture was gone. No rocking chair, no table, no shelves. Just smooth, polished wood, and in the center of the floor, etched into the boards as if drawn by fire, was a circle, a ritual circle, carefully made. And in its center stood a single object, the mirror, the same one from Elswith's room, though its glass now shimmered with movement, like moonlight on water. Corwin moved toward it. As he approached, the lantern flame dipped low, flickering with hesitation. His reflection in the mirror rippled. It didn't mimic his steps perfectly. Its delay grew longer, stranger, until it wasn't mirroring at all. Then the mirror version of Corwin smiled. He hadn't. It raised a hand, not in greeting, but as if to touch him from inside the glass. His real hand moved on instinct, just inches away now. He could feel the cold pouring off it, like the air before a deep storm. And then he saw something in the mirror behind his reflection. A room, but not this room. A narrow space with stone walls and a doorless frame. And in the corner, huddled in the dark, a woman. Her hands were covered in ink, her face pale, eyes sunken, lips moving in silence. Elswith, still alive, still trapped, not in the forest, not in the house. In the mirror, Corwin's reflection leaned closer to the glass, and he heard a whisper from its lips. Help her, or join her. Suddenly, the flame in the lantern surged, casting the reflection into violent shadow. The room spun. The circle on the floor glowed faintly. He staggered back, just in time, as the mirror pulsed once, hard, and a crack spread across, its surface like a lightning bolt. Then the floorboards beneath him trembled. From the corners of the room came footsteps, not one pair, not two, but many, slow, careful, coming closer. He held the lantern high, and as its glow filled the room, he saw them, figures, pale, hollow-eyed, the carved names, the forgotten ones, and they were walking not toward him, but toward the mirror. They moved like smoke in human shape, the figures with hollow eyes and paper-thin skin, each one bearing a carved name from the walls, the trees, the whispers. Bria, Murrow, Sawyer, Alden, and more. They circled the mirror, like mourners at a grave, hands outstretched, not to touch it, but to feed it. You could see it in the way their fingertips hovered over the surface, trembling slightly, as if their energy, whatever was left of it, was being drawn in. And Corwin, he stood just beyond the circle, the lantern in his grasp like a borrowed heartbeat. The mirror was glowing now. The crack across its face had widened, pulsing faintly with light, and the image within was clearer. A stone room, a woman on her knees, her fingers writing something into the ground. Over and over, he could hear her now, faint and frayed like a voice across a great distance. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out. Corwin took a step closer. The lantern flared as it passed the ritual circle, casting a long shadow across the wooden floor. The mirror shimmered and responded, showing not just Elswith now, but himself. Not as he was, as he would be. Pale, hollow-eyed, etched with moss and root. A name carved into the flesh just above his collarbone, Corwin. And then, a second version of him flickered across the glass. This one smiled. Its mouth opened, and Corwin heard his own voice, warped and wet, say, "She had her chance." Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The hollowed figures froze mid-motion, heads turning toward him in eerie unison. One by one, they began to point at the mirror, then down, to the ritual circle, to him, and he understood. Someone had to take her place. That was the bargain. The mirror wasn't just a window, it was a door, but the door only opened one way, unless a soul filled the shape she left behind. Corwin backed away, shaking his head. No. The figures didn't follow, they only watched. And then from behind the mirror, inside it, Elswith raised her. Tears ran down her face, but she smiled, not a smile of hope, a warning. Her lips moved again, this time more clearly. Don't trade what you can't return. Then she lifted her hand, pointed at the lantern, and vanished. Corwin turned the lantern toward the mirror, watching as its blue light deepened. The glow reflected in the glass until the surface looked like a frozen lake. Then something cracked beneath his feet. He looked down. The ritual circle was sinking, inch by inch, into the wood, as if the house was swallowing it whole. A voice, ancient and deep and wrong, whispered from under the floor, "Choose, light or shadow, her or you." The mirror pulsed once more, and Corwin knew the house had made its offer, but the forest remembered, and it never forgot a broken promise. Corwin stood trembling at the edge of the sinking ritual circle, the lantern burning low in his grip. The figures around the mirror were frozen, watching, waiting. Their silence was not passive. It pressed in around him like hands on his chest. The voice beneath the floor came again. "Choose." It wasn't just words anymore. It was pressure. It curled up through the soles of his boots, through the bones of his legs, through his chest. It carried weight, memory, expectation. The mirror began to shift. The image of Ellsworth flickered in and out, sometimes showing her, sometimes Corwin's own face distorted, warped like wet paint sliding off glass. Then the mirror went black. The house whispered. There must always be one. One who sees, one who stays. Corwin stepped into the circle. The wood groaned beneath him. The light from the lantern dimmed again, but the mirror brightened. Its cracked face pulsed with silvery light. The floor gave one last lurch and he fell to one knee. A pain bloomed in his hand. He looked down. The lantern had burned his palm, but the pain was more than heat. It was pull, as if the flame knew what the mirror wanted and refused to give it. Suddenly the figures stepped back, all at once, as though repelled, not by him, by the light. The lantern's blue glow surged, stronger now, brighter. It cast long, sharp shadows against the walls, and in those shadows he saw movement. Branches curling, roots coiling, something vast twisting in the bones of the house. "It remembers more than her," he whispered. And now he remembered. Ellsworth had written her story into the house, but the house had turned the story into a cage, a trap that required belief, attention, a keeper. And Corwin had walked in with both feet and with open eyes. But what if there was a third option? Not escape, not sacrifice, but rewrite. The house was made of memory, of names, of whispers, of choices etched into wood. He stood, raised the lantern, and turned it inward, pointing it straight at the mirror. The glass screamed, not with sound, but light. The crack across it shattered, sending lines of glowing white veining across the frame, like spider webs. The surface writhed, showing flashes of dozens, hundreds, of faces trapped behind it. Some were crying, some were screaming, some were smiling, and then Ellsworth, her face now calm. She nodded, and for the first time reached forward from inside the mirror. The circle beneath Corwin collapsed. The wood gave way, but he didn't fall, because the lantern floated now, burning brighter than ever, casting white-blue fire into every corner of the house. The figures around the mirror vanished in puffs of ash, and as the glass split fully open, the room was filled with a sound like the wind ripping through dead trees. Then silence, and two words, well chosen. When Corwin opened his eyes, he was standing in a room with no mirror, no circle, no figures, only a window. The window. He walked to it, and for the first time, looked through. But instead of darkness, he saw the forest in full daylight, empty, still, waiting. And somewhere behind him, a whisper, not from the house, not from the forest, but from Ellsworth herself. "You didn't break the house. You rewrote the ending." Corwin stood before the window. The glass was clean now, untouched by dust or grime, as though it had been waiting years just to be seen. A soft breeze whispered through the cracked frame, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and something older, something freed. Outside, the forest was no longer pressing in. The trees stood tall and distant. The fog had lifted. But the forest didn't look peaceful. It looked alert, like something waking slowly from a deep, cold dream. He placed a hand against the window pane. The light shifted. For a brief moment, the reflection in the glass was not his own. It was Ellsworth, smiling faintly, standing behind him. A shadow of memory, now untethered. She didn't speak, but Corwin heard her voice in his head, as if carried on the wind itself. The house is never just walls and wood. It's the silence between choices, the space between memory and forgetting. You gave it a new ending, but endings echo. The window grew warmer under his touch. The forest outside shimmered. Again, not from light but layers. Behind the trees he could now see shapes. Not people, structures, stone circles, forgotten paths, arches swallowed by moss, and in the center of it all, something massive. A dark hollow carved into the forest floor. Circular, like a wound, like a well. Corwin turned away from the window just as a creaking sound echoed from deeper in the house. The lantern pulsed once in his hand. The path wasn't over. It had only moved forward. The house was shifting again, but it no longer wanted to trap him. It wanted to be walked. Each board under his foot gave a low, resonant tone, like the keys of a forgotten piano. The rooms he passed through weren't decaying anymore. They were waking up. The wallpaper peeled itself back in slow curls, revealing words written beneath. If she writes the story and he walks the path, the forest waits no more. He passed a mirror. It was cracked, but silent now. No reflections, no watchers. Just stillness. And as he stepped down the stairs, he heard it. The front door, unlocked, open. He paused on the last step. Outside was the forest, but not the one he had entered. Not the one that pulled at his ankles and whispered from the roots. This forest was restored, but it was also empty, and the quiet didn't feel safe. It felt ready. He stepped through the doorway. The wind brushed past his cheek like a hand brushing a page. Somewhere in the trees, a crow called once. The path forward was clear. But behind him, as he glanced over his shoulder, the house had vanished. The forest had changed, not in shape, but in feeling. The trees no longer leaned or whispered, but their stillness wasn't comfort. It was anticipation, as though the entire wood had inhaled and was holding its breath, waiting for Corwin to take another step. Behind him, the house was gone. Not faded, not hidden. Gone, like a dream on waking. Corwin walked. The lantern was still in his hand, the flame steady now, no longer blue but white gold, burning soft and warm like morning light. Birdsong returned, quietly at first. Wind tickled the upper branches, but below, where the ground sloped gently downward, silence thickened again. And that's where he saw it, a low dip in the land, a place where no trees grew, a perfect circle of earth, ringed by old stones, all carved, with symbols half buried in moss. At the center, a hollow, wide, deep, breathing, yes, breathing. The ground around it rose and fell slowly, like a sleeping chest. Roots curled around the edges of the hole like fingers. Every few moments, a whisper of air escaped from the opening, cold and dry and ancient, the same air that had flowed through the house. Corwin stood at the edge. The lantern's light reached only so far into the hole, fading to nothing after a few feet. But in that short distance he could see symbols carved into stone ribs along the walls, strands of old torn parchment caught in the cracks, bones, tiny, bird-like, scattered near the rim and at the very center of the hollow, barely visible. Beneath the shifting soil, a book bound in bark, ink bleeding through its cover like veins. Corwin knelt. The breath from the hollow grew colder. Then he heard the voice again, not from beneath, not from behind, but from within. "This is where," she began. The first word, the first wound. "To heal the forest, the last word must be yours." He reached into the hollow. The book was warm. As he touched it, the lantern's flame dimmed slightly. just enough to cast long, stretched shadows across the circle. He opened the cover. There was only one page, and on that page, one unfinished sentence. Here, the last one chose. A blank line followed, waiting. The wind rose around him like a rising tide. Leaves rustled not from the trees, but from the very ground. They began to form shapes, letters, scattered and broken, tugged by a force that wasn't wind at all. Forest itself was listening. Corwin held the book, the pen trembling in his hand, and the breath beneath the hollow whispered again, "What you write becomes, what you leave becomes lost." He placed the pen to the page. The hollow exhaled, and he began to write. Corwin's hand hovered over the page. Here, the last one chose. The pen felt heavier than it should, not because of its weight, but because of its meaning. Whatever he wrote would not simply be ink on paper. It would ripple through the woods, through memory, through the house that wasn't a house anymore. Behind him, the forest stayed still, listening, judging, waiting. He pressed the nib to the blank space and wrote, not to escape, but to remember. The moment the final period settled into the paper, the lantern's flame vanished, not extinguished, but drawn inward into the book itself. The white gold glow ran like liquid into the ink, soaking the page in light, and the hollow responded. It didn't roar, it sighed, a low, vast exhale that stirred every branch and blade of grass. The trees rustled in reply, and the earth beneath. Corwin's knees pulsed once, like a heartbeat rejoining its rhythm. Then the breathing stopped, not because the hollow had died, but because it had woken up. Corwin stood slowly. The book had changed. Its bark binding was now smooth, marked with only one sigil, the same spiral rune etched on the mirror in the house, now closed. No more pages, no more blood. Just a single sentence and a closed ending. He looked around. The circle of stones had begun to sink into the earth, moss growing over them like fingers tucking in a blanket. The bones crumbled one by one into dust. Even the air changed, less brittle, more alive, and the forest, it breathed differently now. Not like a monster in waiting, but like something healing. A path opened between the trees, one he hadn't seen before. It didn't wind or twist. It didn't close behind him. It simply was. A line of quiet golden light, falling through the branches, leading deeper, not darker. As he followed it, the whispers faded, and in their place, a single clear voice. To remember is to free. To walk is to write. And not all houses are meant to hold us forever. He didn't look back, because there was nothing behind him now but stories. The path was lined with silence, but it wasn't the kind that made your skin crawl. It was the kind that wrapped around you like a woolen cloak after a storm. The trees, though still massive and ancient, no longer loomed. They stood tall and watchful, like old sentinels witnessing something sacred. Corwin walked, the closed book cradled in one hand. Each step felt lighter, but with that lightness came a strange ache, deep in the chest. Not sorrow, but the kind of grief that follows peace. The kind that lingers after something dark has passed through you and left room for something else. The golden light filtering through the canopy wasn't sunlight. It was too soft, too steady. It came from nowhere, and yet it followed him, casting no shadow, asking no permission, and up ahead, he saw it. A clearing. In the center, an ancient tree. Its bark was pale, almost silver, and its leaves were a soft blue-green. Wind didn't move them. They stirred on their own, as though the tree dreamed even while awake. At its base, a wooden pedestal, not carved, grown, as though the tree itself had shaped it for this moment. Corwin stepped into the clearing, the light warming his shoulders. The pedestal welcomed the book without resistance. As soon as he laid it down, the bark cover began to curl open once more, as if the forest itself wished to read. But this time, no sentence appeared, just a single blooming leaf unfurling from the book's spine. It glowed faintly, and the moment it opened fully, the tree spoke, not aloud, but into his thoughts deeply. One story ends, one awakens. The watcher has passed, the weaver must remain. Corwin understood. He had closed the wound, but the forest still needed a memory. And now that the house was gone, someone had to carry it. From the pedestal, the light flowed outward, across the clearing, down the path, into every branch and stone and hollow. Every tree around him bent just slightly in his direction. He was no longer just a guest, he was part of it. Then, in the air before him, leaves spiraled together. They formed a shape, simple, humble, a lantern, identical to the one he'd carried, but made of wood and root and light. It hovered before him, waiting. He reached out. The moment he touched it, the clearing shifted, and the forest spoke one last time, in a voice like breath across water. The house was the key. The hollow was the lock. But you are the keeper of the path. And when Corwin stepped from the clearing, the path behind him did not vanish. It remained. Because now, it followed him. The light no longer led him. It walked with him. Where once he followed whispers and dread through a living nightmare of a house, Corwin now stepped beneath branches that arched like cathedral vaults, his pace steady, his breath unburdened. The forest had shifted, not tamed, but no longer twisted. Not a prison, a place of memory, and now, a place of passage. He passed old places, a stump that once held the remains of a rotted doll, a twisted tree where the wind had whispered names, a sunken grove where bones had surfaced after storms. Each sight felt changed, no longer hiding, no longer waiting to ensnare, but each held a quiet truth. Each had once been part of someone's story. Now they were part of his. As he walked, the lantern he carried pulsed gently with life, not fire, but something deeper. Memory. Echo. An invitation for others to remember. At one point, he paused beside a narrow stream, the water black with peat and smooth stones. In the mirrored surface, he expected to see himself. He did not. He saw Elswith, and beside her, others. A long line of faces, some lost, some returned, all watching. Behind them, the house flickered like a fading star. "You are what it needed," Elswith whispered, her voice carried in the rustle of reeds. "Not to destroy, not to suffer, but to hold the story steady until the next hand arrives." Corwin bent, touched the surface of the water. The reflection vanished, and in its place, a seed, a small pale nut resting in the center of a lily pad. He picked it up. The moment he did, the lantern flared, and he knew the forest would grow in new directions, but only if someone planted memory with purpose. The path he walked was no longer one way. He was the keeper, yes, but also the welcomer. Later, as the sky began to fade into deep blue twilight, Corwin came to a spot that looked oddly familiar, an old stone bench, a twisted post where a lantern once hung, long rusted away, and there, a circle of smooth earth in the center of the path, where nothing grew. He sat on the bench, breath steady. He had been walking for hours, maybe days, and not once had he felt tired. He took the bark-bound book from his satchel, opened it, still only one sentence. Here, the last one chose not to escape, but to remember. He turned the page. It was blank, waiting, again. But this time, he did not write. He set the pen down beside the lantern and whispered, "The next story begins with them." The wind shifted, somewhere far behind him. The house that was no longer a house exhaled one final time. Night had fully arrived, but it wasn't dark. The forest glowed with its own quiet breath, tiny bioluminescent spores floating like fireflies, the lantern beside Corwin humming gently with memory. The trees no longer leaned inward. They stood tall, making space. For him, for whoever might come next. Corwin sat motionless on the stone bench, not guarding, not waiting, keeping. He wasn't sure how long he'd been there when he heard it. Twig snap, not close, just far enough that it could have been the forest playing tricks. But no, It came again. A shuffle of hesitant footsteps, the brittle hush of someone trying not to be heard. He stood, slowly. The forest held its breath, and from between two pines, someone emerged. A girl, no more than 12. Hair in tangled braids, eyes wide and scanning. She wore a too large coat and clutched a small satchel like it held her last hope. She froze when she saw him. He didn't speak. The lantern pulsed once at his side. She blinked at it, took a step closer. He offered no threat, just a nod, and slowly, carefully, he bent and picked up the book, still blank on its second page, and placed it on the bench. Then he turned, stepped off the path, and walked into the woods without looking back. He wasn't needed anymore. She was. The forest rustled around her, not frightening now, just curious. She stepped forward, approaching the book and the lantern. Her small fingers hovered over the worn bark of the cover, then opened it. Her lips moved as she read the sentence Corwin had written long ago. Here the last one chose not to escape, but to remember. She looked around. The woods felt like they were listening. Then she turned the page, and for the first time in a very long time, she whispered into the forest, "Here, I choose to begin." The lantern flared. The book warmed. The trees sighed, and the path behind her closed, because now it belonged to her. The girl sat cross-legged before the open book. No pages turned, not from wind, but from will. One at a time, the bark-smooth leaves of parchment turned themselves in slow procession, revealing words that had not been written by her hand, but by the forest itself. They weren't stories. They were memories. She read of the house before it crumbled, of Corwin's first arrival, of the shifting mirrors, of the locked doors and breathing floors, of Elswith's silent watch at the attic window. Each memory she read became a flicker in the lantern's flame beside her. With every flicker, she understood a little more. She was not alone in her arrival. She was never meant to be. Then the words stopped. The pages turned blank again. But this time, the ink came from somewhere else. The trees. The bark on nearby trunks curled slightly. Moss peeled back. Tiny, root-like letters etched themselves into their surface. A keeper must not only carry the past, she must listen to what the forest needs next. The girl nodded. She took the pen, dipped it into the lantern's light, and wrote, "I am not lost. I was chosen." The forest replied. Branches above bent low, gently twisting into a soft arch above her. Not a trap, not a cage. A canopy, a shelter. Around her, other shapes began to appear. Stone steps from the soil, leading nowhere. Yet a circle of mushrooms, like a door still waiting to open. Shadows of people she had never met, pausing just long enough to smile. She wrote again, "I will remember those who wandered before, and when the next one comes, I'll leave the path open." The forest sighed. This time it didn't feel like breath. It felt like song, quiet, hollow, full of endings and beginnings. The lantern pulsed one final time, then gently rooted itself into the ground beside her. No longer a tool, a beacon, a soft, golden glow that would never fully fade. In the distance behind the girl, someone else stepped into the forest. Their shoes were wet, their shoulders hunched, their heart heavy with forgetting. But ahead of them, far off through the trees, a light glimmered, and though they didn't yet know what it was, they began walking toward it. The house was gone. The hollow had healed. But the forest would always remain, because now it had a voice. The roots had always been there, twisting beneath the forest floor like veins under skin, older than memory, deeper than bones. But now they stirred, not with hunger, but with awakening. And somewhere far beneath the surface, in a place where earth met silence and time pooled like water, it dreamed. The girl felt it first. She'd begun to sleep near the lantern, curled. In a circle of moss, the book pressed to her chest. Her dreams were different now. Not fragments of fear or shadowy memories, but echoes of something ancient and watching. In her dreams, the roots reached out, not to take, but to offer. They whispered names, not hers, not Corwin's, but names lost so long ago, even the wind had forgotten how to pronounce them. Iluna, they whispered, Vorin, Thala, and the first who sang without a mouth. She followed the dream downward, through the soil, through the hush of sleeping worms and sighing stone, until she reached the heartwood, a vast, hollow chamber beneath the oldest tree in the forest, lit not by sun or lantern, but by memory alone, pale and flickering like moonlight through old lace. And at the center of it, a throne made of twisted root and bark, empty, waiting. She approached it. The roots pulsed softly with her steps, as if the forest were holding its breath again. She reached out to touch the throne, and felt everything. She felt Corwin's hand trembling as he first opened the mirror, Elswith's tears when she locked the attic door, the scream of the first keeper when the forest swallowed them whole, the laughter of the one who carved the lantern from living wood, and something else, a sorrow that had never found a name, a grief not hers, but somehow meant for her. Not all dreams are made to be escaped, the roots whispered. Some are made to be remembered. The girl stepped back. She did not sit on the throne. She bowed to it, and when she rose, a single blossom bloomed at its base, pale white, silent, fragrant with stories yet to be told. She awoke in her moss bed just before dawn. The lantern still pulsed. The book still rested in her arms, but now the roots beneath her carried a new hum, a low, living lullaby. And she knew the forest did not forget. It dreamed. And now, so did she. There were no more signs nailed to trees, no more warnings written in blood or charcoal, no more trails that vanished when you turned your back. The path had changed. Now it spoke. It began subtly. The girl, now called Mara by the forest, though she'd never told it her name, noticed first in the leaves. Certain ones fell with symbols etched into them, spirals, arrows, crescent moons. One morning she found a message traced in moss along a fallen log. Not all who wander are lost. Some are returning. That day the lantern beside her brightened, as if pleased, and when she walked, the very ground beneath her shifted to meet her steps, laying stone and root just ahead, guiding, not forcing. The forest wasn't leading her anywhere. It was asking her where she wanted to go. She tested it, paused at a fork where two overgrown paths met, a deer trail swallowed by brambles, and a hollow corridor of birch trees. She whispered, "Take me to where I'm needed." The brambles pulled back, slowly, carefully. No threat, no pain, just the sound of leaves sighing open. And through the newly opened trail, she stepped into a space the forest had kept secret. It was a grove, circular, still. At its center was a child no older than Mara had once been, curled in a nest of dry leaves, eyes wide and glassy, breathing shallow as though caught in a dream too deep. Mara didn't speak at first. She sat beside the child, laid the lantern gently between them, and opened the book, not to the beginning, not to the throne's memory, but to a new page. And she wrote, "Here is someone who did not ask to be lost, but the path found her anyway." The lantern pulsed, the child blinked, and the forest sighed in relief. Mara carried the child back to the path, not to the edge of the forest, but to the clearing where the forest first reveals itself to the willing. There, she gave her a name. She gave her the book, and she stepped aside, because the path had found its next voice. Somewhere far off, beneath the roots, the dream stirred again, and this time it whispered with pride. The story does not belong to one. It belongs to all who walk it. In the deepest hours of night, when the sky turns black-blue and even the wind holds its breath, the forest listens hardest. That's when the whispers return, not the ones that haunt, not anymore. These whispers are left behind by those who walk the path and left part of themselves behind, not in fear, but in love, in memory, in quiet trust. And Mara could hear them. She sat by the roots of the oldest tree, now called the Dreaming Hollow, listening with eyes closed. They came not as voices but shapes of thought. A boy who had once fled from thunder, now teaching the trees to hum his lullabies. A woman who planted knives in the soil so they would become vines instead. Corwin's soft breath as he passed beneath a willow, never fully looking back, and someone else. A whisper that felt like cold water, smooth stone, and unspoken grief. Mara frowned. She listened deeper. This whisper did not want to be found, but it needed to be. So Mara followed it, not by trail, not by footprints, but by absence. Wherever the birds stopped singing, where light refused to stay, where even the trees stood at a distance. That's where it was. She came upon a hollow in the forest floor, round, silent, and cracked at the edges like a wound too old to bleed. No lanterns burned here, no moss grew, only shadows. Still, patient, Mara whispered, "Who are you?" And something answered, not in words but in shape. A figure rose from the hollow, childlike, genderless, made of mist and memory and ash. Not evil, just unfinished. "I was the one the forest forgot," it said inside her head. "I left no story, no page. I passed in silence." Mara stepped forward, knelt before the figure. She didn't ask what it wanted, she already knew. She opened the book, and for the first time, she didn't write words. She drew, a hand reaching out of shadow, a lantern lowered from above, a path curling, like smoke, then turning into song. The figure blinked and smiled. Not much, just enough. Then it faded, not into dust, but into wind. And for the first time in that hollow, a single flower grew, pale, silent. "True," Mara whispered back. "You are not forgotten. You're written now." And the forest wept, quietly, gratefully. Long before Mara arrived, before Corwin, even before the first keeper carved the lantern from the heartwood, there had been a girl. She had lived in the house when it was still a house, with walls, windows, and laughter that echoed through the halls. Her name was never recorded, not in books, not in bark, not even in the soil, but the attic remembered her. Mara came upon it by accident, or so she thought. She had wandered further than usual, following a trail of pale petals that fell from no tree. Their color was strange, dusty violet, like old ink left in the sun. They fluttered down one at a time, always just ahead, always inviting. They led her to a clearing where no light reached the ground. There stood a remnant. Not the full house, just the attic, suspended impossibly in air, supported by the twisting trunks of 4 blackened trees. Its windows were opaque with soot. Its shutters creaked softly, as if sighing in dreams. Mara hesitated. Then she climbed. The ladder was made of branches twisted into rungs, not nailed or built. It had grown from the forest itself, as if the attic were not a ruin, but a memory the woods refused to let go. She stepped inside. The air was dry with sorrow. Dust floated in columns of cold light. Every corner pulsed with old grief. And then she saw them, petals, thousands, scattered across the attic floor like snow, each one inked with a single word. She knelt and began to read. Each petal told part of a story, out of order, fragmented. He never came back. They said it was my fault. I locked the door and never unlocked it again. If someone reads this, please, don't forget me. Mara's heart sank. This girl, this long-lost soul, had not been a villain. She had been a silence, a wound no one had named. At the center of the attic, Mara found a bed, still made. A small satchel resting on the pillow, petals blooming gently around it. She reached for it, her hands trembling. Inside, a mirror, but not like the others that had once trapped Corwin in visions. This mirror reflected memory, not form, and when she looked into it, she saw the girl. Not ghostly, not terrifying, just waiting, alone. Mara lifted the mirror, cradled it in her arms. and whispered, "I remember you. I don't need your name to know your pain." The petals rose around her. They circled once, and, one by one, they disappeared, not destroyed but absorbed by the attic itself, as if the space had finally exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. Mara descended. The attic remained above her, but it no longer pulsed with grief. It simply was a room waiting for stories, not mourning them. And in the satchel, beneath where the mirror had rested, a single petal remained, this one blank. Mara placed it in her book and closed it. The forest had names for many things. It named the rivers in syllables only moss could pronounce. It named the wind in sighs that sounded like lullabies. It named the pain beneath the soil, the light above the leaves. But until now, it had never spoken Mara's name aloud. She was walking the quiet path, just after a pale rain, the air thick with the smell of wet pine and secrets, when it happened. A hush fell so deep that even her breath seemed disrespectful. Then, from the trees themselves, low and soft, "Mara." She froze, not out of fear, but recognition. The voice wasn't like a whisper or a scream. It was like the sound a river makes under ice, muffled, ancient, certain. "Mara, come back." She turned, though she hadn't taken a step. The forest didn't ask her to move. It was asking her to remember. The path ahead twisted itself into a ring of stone and vine, beckoning inward, a place she had never seen, but had somehow been waiting for. She stepped through. The temperature dropped, not cold, just still. The space smelled not of forest, but of pages and ash. Before her lay a hollow, deep, carved with purpose. Its walls smoothed like something had once lived inside it, or perhaps still did. It wasn't threatening. It was personal. And at the center, a shape. It was a chair. No, not a chair. A cradle made of interwoven branches and silk-thin bark, glowing faintly like embered wood. Inside it, a cocoon, breathing, slow, gentle, waiting. Mara approached, hands trembling but steady. She knelt beside it, and the breathing paused, just long enough for her to hear her name again. Not from the trees, not from her memory, from within the cocoon. "Mara." Not a call for help, a thank you. Then the bark of the cradle began to shift, unfolding petal by petal like a bloom caught in reverse. Inside, curled like a sleeping fawn, was herself. Not as she was now, but as she had been. Before. Before the house. Before the forest. Before the forgetting. She leaned in, her past self opened her eyes and smiled. For the first time in her life, Mara didn't feel alone inside her own skin. She reached forward, and as fingertip met fingertip, the cocoon vanished. No smoke, no flare, just quiet. And Mara stood alone again, but whole. As she stepped out of the hollow, the wind returned. So did the birds. The path remained open behind her, and from the roots below, she heard only this: "You came back to yourself. We always hoped you would." Not all who enter the forest walk its paths. Some stand still. They watch. They listen. And they wait by the fire. They are not shadows. They are not ghosts. They are not alive in the way Mara was. But neither were they gone. The forest called them the Watchers of Flame. Mara first saw them on a night when no stars came out. The trees above had sealed tight. Even the moon's glow couldn't reach her. She'd lit her lantern for comfort, but the flame was strange that night. It flickered towards something, not away, as though it recognized someone unseen. She followed it. The air grew warmer, not like day, but like something ancient and sacred had begun to wake beneath the dirt. Her steps were soft, instinctive. She was not choosing to go forward, she was being invited. And then, in a grove blackened by time but unburned, she saw them. They stood in a circle, 12 of them, the Watchers. Figures robed in woven leaves, bark, and ash, their faces hidden behind masks of root and bone. Each held a flame cupped gently in their palms. The flames did not waver, Even in the breeze that curled like breath between them, they did not speak. They did not move. They only turned, all at once, toward her. Mara nearly stepped back, but the lantern in her hands grew heavier, as if reminding her, "You belong here." So she stepped into the circle. One of the watchers extended their hands, not threateningly, offering, and Mara, without knowing why, reached into her satchel and pulled out the blank petal from the attic. The watcher took it, held it above the flame. The petal ignited, slow, not destroyed, but transformed, burning into a curl of glowing smoke that lifted toward the canopy like a memory finally spoken. Then they all turned again, this time toward the center of the circle, a pit of ash. Cold, ancient, until now. With a deep inhale from the forest itself, a new fire burst forth. Small, violet white, flickering not with heat, but with stories. Within it, Mara saw the attic girl, smiling through a window. Corwin, leaving behind his mirror. A child writing in the book with ink made of moonlight. Herself, touching the cradle of her past. This was not a fire for warmth. This was a keeper's flame. A place where stories didn't end. They were remembered, carried, watched. The watchers bowed, not to Mara, but to the flame. And then, one by one, they stepped into it, not screaming, not vanishing, just merging, becoming part of the light. And when the last watcher was gone, the grove went quiet. The flame still burned, and Mara knew what she had to do. She sat, she opened the book, and she began to write. The flame burned quietly behind Mara. It didn't consume. It didn't crackle. It remembered. And as she wrote, a soft humming began. Not from the trees, but from the air itself. Like the forest was reading along, word by word. But even as the warmth surrounded her, something sharp and cold called from beyond the grove. She turned. It was a glint, barely noticeable, just beyond the tree line. Glass. A shard. Stuck upright in the soil like a splinter in the earth's skin. Mara hesitated. The forest didn't warn her. It didn't need to. This was a memory unspoken, not a danger. She approached the glass, bent and looked. It was a mirror, but not whole. Just one broken piece of a much larger one, cracked and weathered by time. She expected to see her reflection. Instead, she heard a voice, faint, from within the glass. I waited too long to speak. Now I can only echo. The glass shimmered. Inside, she saw images, not hers, not recent. A boy sitting in a high attic room, scribbling into journals, not Corwin. Older, different. His room was ringed with mirrors, some covered, some shattered. He wasn't trapped. He was studying them. Mara listened harder. The voice in the shard continued, soft as frost. I thought if I understood the mirrors, I could control what they showed. I wanted to tame memory, but you cannot tame what isn't yours to own. The boy in the glass watched himself fade over time, growing paler, quieter, until even his reflection began to ignore him, until only the mirrors remembered he had ever existed. Mara reached out and touched the shard. The moment she did, she felt it. A pulse, like a heartbeat, not hers, not the forest's. The mirror was alive, still holding the voice of a boy who had tried to understand too much. She didn't try to fix the glass. Instead, she took it, wrapped it in moss and thread, placed it beside her lantern, and in the book she wrote, "Not all stories are meant to be seen. Some are meant to be heard, even if only in broken pieces." And in that moment, the shard warmed slightly in her hand. A thank you, faint, but real. That night, as she camped near the flame, the shard reflected not her face, but a single word, carved faintly across its surface. Listen, and she did, until she fell asleep. The dreams that came to Mara that night were not her own. She saw from behind eyes that had long since closed, felt footsteps press against soft loam where no light reached, heard breathing that echoed beneath the world, not above it. When she woke. The flame behind her still burned, but the earth beneath her hand was warm and moving. She sat up slowly, watched the moss part around her fingers. Something old was stirring, not malicious, forgotten. There had always been whispers of what lay below the forest, deeper than roots, deeper than bones. A veil, they said, not between life and death, but between story and silence. The place where unwritten things waited. And now it was calling her. Mara packed quietly, bringing only the lantern, her book, and the shard of mirror. She followed the warmth in the soil until it pulsed beneath her like a second heartbeat. Then she found it. An opening between gnarled tree roots, wide enough to crawl through, blacker than pitch. She didn't hesitate. She went in. The descent was slow. The roots narrowed, then widened, then seemed to vanish entirely. Her lantern dimmed, not from lack of oil, but as if the air here refused to glow. When she reached the bottom, her feet touched something soft, not soil, ash. She had entered the veil. It was not a cave. It was not a tunnel. It was a space that did not belong in the world above. Soft walls of gray mist pulsed like lungs. Whispers hung in the air like threads, just out of reach, and at the center of it all, a figure kneeling in stillness. It was not a person. It was a form, shaped like one, but made of script. Its skin was words, sentences, chapters, some complete, most incomplete. As Mara stepped closer, she saw that the figure was erasing itself. Each breath it took, a phrase vanished from its body, a name fell away from its chest. A memory crumbled from its spine, a dream bled from its fingertips like ink. Mara whispered, "Who are you?" It looked up slowly, and she saw her own eyes staring back at her. But they were blank, hollow, waiting to be filled. "I am what you would have been if you never wrote." Mara knelt beside it. She opened her book, held her pen to the page, and asked, "May I write you now?" The figure said nothing, but it nodded, just once, and so she wrote. Not from memory, but from possibility. She wrote a girl who never feared the forest, a voice that never silenced itself, a story that remembered its storyteller. As she wrote, the figure began to glow, not brightly, but like embers rising through fog. Its erased skin turned to light. Its hollow eyes reflected warmth, and then it spoke. "Thank you for remembering the version of me that never got to be," and vanished, not like a ghost, like a prayer released. When Mara rose, the veil had quieted. She turned and climbed back up, through soil, through stone, through root, and when she emerged, the forest had bloomed everywhere, as if it too had been holding its breath. The forest was alive in a new way now, not louder, not brighter, just awake. Colors seemed deeper, shadows gentler. Even the wind moved as if it had remembered a song it once knew. And Mara, for the first time, felt known by the woods, not watched, not studied, but recognized. She walked the path, without fear, lantern in hand. But the lantern, it had changed too. It flickered strangely, not weakly, not wild, but anxiously, like something inside it was unsure of what came next. Mara knelt and examined it. The wood, once polished and smooth, was splintering. The glass had begun to spiderweb from the corners. It wasn't wear or age, it was a choice. The lantern had reached the edge of its story, and it was ready to end. She remembered what Corwin had once said. The lantern doesn't protect you. It holds the forest back, just enough to let you pass. But what if it wasn't supposed to hold anything back anymore? What if the forest no longer needed to be kept away? She brought the lantern to the stone circle where the watchers had once stood. The flame still burned at the center, soft, eternal, pulsing with story. She placed the lantern at the flame's edge and waited. The flame reached out, not like fire, but like a curious hand. It touched the base of the lantern, A soft sound echoed, a crack like a whispered farewell. The wood split, the glass gave way, and from inside the lantern, something rose. It wasn't fire, it wasn't light, it was memory. A small wisp of glowing mist, shaped like nothing, shaped like everything. Moments Mara had lived, seen, carried. It floated once around her head, like a moth circling a candle. Then it drifted into the eternal flame and vanished. Mara expected to feel loss. Instead, she felt lighter. The lantern was gone. But in its place, she had gained something else. A truth. She no longer needed to be guided by its light, because the forest no longer saw her as a guest. It saw her as part of the story. From that day forward, she walked without the lantern, and wherever she stepped, the path revealed itself. Not because it was lit, but because the forest knew her name now, and she knew its silence. Mara no longer walked with a light in her hand, and yet she could see. She saw deeper into the woods than she ever had. Not just the paths, but the threads between the paths. Connections, memories, places where time hung like dew. The forest didn't speak with words. It never had. But now it was learning her language. And one morning, just before dawn, the forest did something it had never done before. It spoke her name back. She was standing at the edge of a ravine. Mist pooled like breath between the cliffs, and the trees leaned in around her, curious. Then, from the ravine's hollow depth, not a whisper, not an echo, but a voice, deep, layered, familiar and strange. Mara. She froze, not out of fear, but awe. It wasn't like before, when her name had drifted through the trees in a hush. This time it was the forest itself speaking, every leaf, root, gust, and ripple joining together to say it. Mara. Like the name was being remembered, not just said, but returned. She stepped closer to the ravine's edge. It didn't fall into darkness. It rose with memory. Images unfolded in the fog like reflections on water. A girl in a forgotten attic, eyes wide with stories. The first time Mara stepped into the woods, heart pounding. The moment she touched the cradle and saw her past self smile. The lantern's flame rising into the sky like a goodbye that didn't need grief. Then, one more image, faint, distant, but real, a small cabin. Not ruined, not rotted, still whole, covered in moss, yes. But the windows glowed faintly. The door stood open, waiting. The forest spoke again. Come home. Not a command, a permission. All this time, Mara had wandered the edges, followed the trails, faced the mirrors and veils and watchers. But now it was time to return to something she hadn't dared hope still existed. Not a place, not exactly, but a piece of herself that had stayed behind. She followed the thread through the trees. It wasn't a path. It was an instinct. Her feet touched, roots that lifted slightly to help her step. Branches parted as she passed. Birds watched her, not with fear but with memory. When she reached the clearing, the cabin stood just as the fog had shown her. Small, simple, and safe. Mara stood at the threshold. The forest didn't speak again. It didn't need to, because this was the moment when she chose to enter, to stay, to be part of the story, not as a visitor, but as a keeper. And so, with quiet breath and steady heart, she stepped through the doorway. Inside, it smelled like ink and bark and morning light. There was a desk, a window, a fire, and a book, waiting to be written. The door closed behind. Mara, without a sound, no gust of wind, no unseen hand, it simply understood. She was home now, not in the place she was born, but in the place she had always been becoming. The cabin's air felt warm but not stale. It didn't carry the silence of abandonment. It carried the stillness of preparation. A table waited by the window. A book lay open upon it, spine soft with time. A pen rested beside it, not untouched, but unfinished. Mara stepped forward and looked at the pages, and froze. The writing inside was hers. Every curve of ink, every hesitation, every flourish. But she hadn't written this yet. The entries spoke of things she had felt, but not yet put into words. The flame didn't need to last forever. It only needed to last long enough to bring me here. Some names aren't given, they're grown. I am not lost. I am rooted. Mara ran her fingers down the pages. The ink shimmered faintly, like it was still drying, like the book had been writing itself as she lived her story. Or perhaps the room had always known what she would say. A wind stirred outside, not wild, not warning, but welcoming. She looked around the small room and noticed other details. A candle whose wick had never been lit but never gathered dust. A glass jar filled with feathers, moss, and one perfectly smooth stone. A coat rack holding a single red scarf, the one she lost as a child. A mirror on the wall, not cracked, not hiding, just waiting. She approached the mirror and saw herself, not younger, not older, but complete, and behind her reflection stood the forest, no longer a thing she had to escape, solve, or survive. It was with her now, part of her. Mara returned to the table. She picked up the pen. The ink still flowed as if no time had passed at all, and for the first time she wrote without fear that the page might disappear. She wrote, "The forest did not trap me. It waited until I stopped running, until I started listening, until I was ready to tell the story that had been growing in the roots all along." Outside, the trees swayed gently, not whispering secrets anymore, but singing. The wind outside had grown still again, but inside, beneath the hush, Mara began to notice something strange. A sound. Not voices, not footsteps. A song. So faint she thought it was in her head at first, but the longer she sat at the desk, the more. It pressed gently into her thoughts, like someone humming from under the floor. Low, melodic, familiar, and impossibly old. She rose from the desk, stepped carefully across the cabin floor. The sound grew clearer, not louder, deeper. She knelt beside a knotted board near the hearth, one she hadn't noticed earlier. It looked ordinary, but pulsed ever so slightly beneath her hand, almost like a heartbeat. Mara pried the board loose with the edge of her pen. It didn't resist. Beneath it lay not dust or stone, but soft earth, packed and dark, and something was buried there. Not hidden, cradled. She reached in, hands steady, and lifted out a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth and thread made of woven bark. It felt warm in her palms, as if the forest had kept it close for a very long time. She undid the ties. Inside was a music box, carved with symbols she had seen before in the clearing, on the watchers. In her dreams, it wasn't rusted. It hadn't aged. It had been waiting. She turned the small key at its base. It clicked once, then again, and the song began to play. It was the same melody she had heard through the floor, but now it rang clear, its notes sharp as frost and soft as moss. As the music filled the cabin, the walls shimmered faintly, like they too remembered the sound. And then Mara saw it, images dancing across the wood grain of the walls like shadows cast by candlelight. She saw a child curled beneath tree roots, singing to stay awake. A woman walking alone through a storm, clutching the same box. A voice whispering lullabies into a cradle woven from forest vines. A boy lost in fog, guided back by melody alone. The song belonged to all of them, to every soul the forest had once held. Every voice it had kept quiet, every story half finished. It wasn't a tune, it was a thread, woven through time and bark and breath. And now it had found its final singer. Mara pressed the box to her chest and whispered, "I hear you." The song faded, but its echo remained in the cabin's corners, and in her, a chorus waiting in the silence. She carefully rewrapped the music box and placed it on the shelf above the hearth. No longer buried, now remembered. And the forest, in return, let out a long, contented sigh through the trees outside. There was only one place Mara hadn't yet explored in the cabin. A small door beneath the staircase, narrow, wooden, sealed with no handle, no hinges, no lock. It hadn't drawn her attention before, but tonight, after the music box had been placed on its shelf and the song had faded into memory, she noticed it, and she realized it had been there since. The moment she arrived, she just hadn't been ready to see it. Mara stepped toward it. The room quieted. Even the fire dimmed, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She placed her palm flat against the wood. It was smooth, warm, still, but watching her, waiting. She didn't try to push, didn't try to force it. Instead, she whispered, "I'm not here to control you. I'm here to understand." The floor beneath her shifted, not physically but subtly, like something vast beneath the house had stirred in acknowledgement. The door quivered gently and opened. No creak, no gust, just space. The room behind it was impossibly small and impossibly deep, like a closet that didn't end. Mara stepped inside and the air changed. No dust, no scent, only memory. There were shelves, lined with stories, but not books. Objects, a tiny cracked porcelain teacup, a single dried flower wrapped in thread, a child's glove, torn but clean, a mirror shard with fog still clinging to it, and at the very center, a photograph. Mara picked it up. It was black and white, faded but clear. A woman stood in the forest, holding a lantern, the lantern, and a child beside her held the same red scarf Mara had found in the cabin. The woman looked just like Mara, but older, worn, eyes hollowed by something more than time. She turned the photo over. One word had been scratched into the back. Daughter. Mara sat with it, hands trembling, but not from fear, from clarity. She wasn't the first to come here. She wasn't even the first to stay. The cabin hadn't only been waiting for her, it had been remembering her lineage. She had returned not just to her story, but to one that stretched behind her, all the way into forgotten roots. The door behind her stayed open now. The past wasn't something to be locked away anymore. It had been seen, and so she returned the photograph to the shelf, and as she stepped back into the main room, the house breathed once again. The fire flickered up, the wind kissed the windows, and Mara knew the forest had shown her everything it could. There was one more thing left to do. Right, not just for herself, but for the ones who had come before, and for the ones who might still come. Morning came slowly, the kind of morning that didn't rise with a shout of sun, but crept soft and golden through the trees. The forest didn't sing. It listened. And inside the cabin, Mara sat at the desk once again, the pen in her hand, weightless as breath. There were no more questions, no riddles, no mirrors left unturned, no ghosts still hiding in the corners of her mind. The forest had shown her its memory. The house had opened every door. Now, it was her turn. She opened the journal, the one that had written itself in her voice. But now, the pages ahead were blank, waiting, not for the forest's words, but for hers. This is the story of a house, she began, that waited longer than most houses wait. It waited not for owners, not for trespassers, not even for answers. It waited for the right hand to finish what was started long ago. She wrote for hours. She wrote until the sun had risen through the trees and poured down the walls like honey, until the fire burned low and steady, until the birds outside dared to sing again. Every word poured from her like something already known. She wrote, "The forest doesn't trap you. It tests you. It asks you if you're willing to be changed, if you're willing to stay changed. And if you are, it lets you come home." As the final word left the page, the cabin sighed around her. A warm breath through the wood, a shift in the air, the sound of the forest accepting the story. She stood. The book closed itself, slowly, like eyelids after a long day. Mara didn't need to take it with her. She didn't need to leave the forest anymore. She was part of it now, not buried, not trapped, rooted. She stepped outside. The light was soft. The trail had vanished, but not in a way that left her lost. It had simply dissolved, because there were no more trails to follow, only stories to grow. Behind her, the house stood still and quiet, but if you listened closely, you could hear the page turn. Another voice would one day enter that house. Another story would one day begin, but for now, the house could rest. Its story was told. The end. The forest never needed to be feared, only understood. Mara's journey has ended, but the trees still whisper, and the house still waits for someone else to wander too far, too deep, and discover something they didn't know they'd lost. Thank you for walking this quiet, haunted path with us. And remember, somewhere out there another house waits beneath the leaves, and it just might know your name. Sleep well.